racist white woman hits black man, she's shocked when he hits back. The sickening sound of metal grinding against metal echoed through the parking lot as Sarah Thompson's SUV deliberately rammed into Michael Jennings's car. Through his rearview mirror, he caught her triumphant smirk, the same hateful expression he'd seen countless times during his 15 years serving justice as a public defender. But this time was different. This wasn't just another case. This was personal. As he reached for his phone to call the police, memories flooded back. The families he'd helped, the lives he'd changed, and most importantly, the promise he made to his dying mother, to fight injustice without losing his humanity. What happens next would shake the foundations of not just their lives, but an entire community's perception of justice, prejudice, and redemption. None of them could have predicted how their paths had already crossed in ways that would make this confrontation far more complex than a simple parking dispute. Hey everyone! Before we dive into this powerful story of justice and redemption, drop a comment letting us know where you're watching from, and hit that like button. Your support means the world to us. At 42, Michael Jennings carried himself with the quiet dignity of a man who had seen both the best and worst of humanity. Standing 6 feet tall, with broad shoulders and gentle eyes that had witnessed too much, he dedicated his life to defending those who couldn't defend themselves. As one of the few black public defenders in Springfield, Massachusetts, his office walls bore testament to his commitment, not with fancy degrees, although he had those too from Harvard Law, but with thank you letters from families he'd helped over 15 years. Every morning before heading to court, Michael would stop at St. Mary's Hospital to visit his mother, Sarah Jennings, who was battling stage 4 breast cancer. He'd bring her fresh flowers and read her the morning paper, just as she had done for him throughout his childhood. Even as the cancer ravaged her body, Helen Jennings remained her son's moral compass, always reminding him, justice without compassion is just another form of violence. Despite his professional success, Michael's personal life was marked by the subtle indignities familiar to many black men in America: the security guards who followed him in stores, the women who clutched their purses tighter in elevators, the police officers who pulled him over for routine checks in his own neighborhood. He handled each incident with the same measured patience his mother had taught him, though each cut left its invisible scar. His colleagues at the public defender's office respected him, not just for his impressive 85% success rate in cases, but for his unique approach to justice. Michael was known for taking the time to understand both sides of every story, often finding solutions that helped not just his clients, but their communities as well. His latest initiative, a rehabilitation program for first-time offenders, had earned praise from both law enforcement and civil rights activists, a rare bridge across a widening divide. But behind his professional composure, Michael carried a private burden. His mother's cancer treatments were expensive, far beyond what insurance would cover. He'd been quietly selling his possessions, including his prized collection of vintage jazz records, to help pay the mounting medical bills. His mother didn't know. He'd made sure that, just as she didn't know, he'd been sleeping in his office 3 nights a week to save money. That Sunday morning, as he pulled into the grocery store parking lot, Michael was exhausted. He'd spent the night reviewing cases, preparing for a crucial hearing on Monday. All he wanted was to grab some groceries and spend the afternoon with his mother. He had found a spot near the entrance, a small mercy on a busy weekend, and carefully parked his aging but meticulously maintained Toyota Camry, the same car his mother had helped him buy when he passed the bar exam. He couldn't have known that this simple act of parking his car would set in motion a chain of events that would test everything he believed about justice, mercy, and the price of doing what's right in a world often punishes exactly that. Sarah Thompson's life was a study in contrasts. At 45, her carefully maintained blonde hair and designer clothes couldn't mask the deep grief etched into her face. 3 years ago, she had been Sarah Anderson Thompson, proud wife of Detective James Thompson, living in their dream house in Springfield's affluent Oak Hill neighborhood. Now, she was just the widow Thompson, raising her critically ill 12-year-old daughter Emma alone, haunted by the night that changed everything. James had been killed during what the media called the Springfield riots, when peaceful protests over police brutality erupted into violence. He wasn't even on duty that night. He'd gone to help evacuate a mixed-race family trapped in their store. The official report said he died protecting them from looters. What the report didn't mention was his last phone call to Sarah. "These people aren't our enemies, honey. They're just scared, like us. We've got to do better." Emma was 9 when she lost her father. 2 months later, she was diagnosed with a rare blood disorder that required constant medical attention. The insurance money from James's death barely covered their mounting medical bills, forcing Sarah to sell their house and move to a smaller apartment. She took a job as an administrative assistant at the same police department where James had served, watching his former colleagues avoid eye contact in the hallways, their guilty silence a daily reminder of her loss. The grief hardened something in Sarah. She began attending police union meetings, becoming increasingly vocal about law and order and defending the blue. Her social media posts grew more strident, her views more extreme. When Chief Robert Anderson, her late husband's partner and Emma's godfather, suggested she join concerned citizens groups, she dove in head first, finding comfort in their angry certainty about who was to blame for society. But late at night, when Emma's illness kept them both awake, Sarah would remember James's last words and feel the sharp sting of betraying his memory. Emma, despite her illness, had inherited her father's compassionate nature. She volunteered at the hospital's pediatric ward whenever her health allowed, making friends regardless of their background. Dad always said, kindness matters more than being right. She'd remind her mother during their increasingly frequent arguments about race and politics. That Sunday morning, Sarah was running on empty. Emma's latest treatment had failed, and the doctors were talking about experimental procedures they couldn't afford. Chief Anderson had promised to help, but his assistance came with the increasingly uncomfortable request for her to speak at political rallies about police vulnerability. She had spotted the empty parking space at the grocery store from across the lot, flicking on her turn signal and waiting. When the black Toyota slid into her spot, something inside her snapped. As she confronted the well-dressed black man stepping out of the car, Sarah Thompson wasn't thinking about her late husband's words of unity. She wasn't thinking about Emma's gentle reminders about kindness. She was thinking only of her own pain, her own loss, and the desperate need to make someone else hurt as much as she did. Neither she nor Michael Jennings could have imagined how their lives were already intertwined, or how their confrontation would expose secrets that would shake their community to its core. "Hey!" Sarah's voice cracked through the morning air like a whip. That was my spot." Michael Jennings paused halfway out of his Toyota, one hand still on the door. The woman storming toward him was practically vibrating with rage, her blonde hair catching the sunlight, designer purse swinging wildly from her shoulder. "Excuse me?" he responded, keeping his voice deliberately calm. 15 years as a public defender had taught him how quickly situations could escalate. "Don't you excuse me, Sarah spat, jabbing a manicured finger in his direction. "I had my blinker on. I was waiting. You people just take whatever you want, don't you?" The phrase, "you people," hung in the air between them. Michael felt the familiar weight settle onto his shoulders, the burden of having to be the rational one, the calm one, the one who couldn't afford to show anger. "Ma'am, I didn't see any car waiting. The spot was empty when I pulled in." He gestured to his bar association parking tag. "I'm actually running late for an appointment." "Oh, of course you have an appointment." Sarah's laugh was bitter, theatrical. "Playing dress-up in that suit doesn't make you belong here. This is Oak Hill. My husband—" She stopped abruptly, color flooding her cheeks. "Your husband what, ma'am?" Michael's tone remained professional, but his jaw tightened. Around them, other shoppers were beginning to take notice, some slowing their pace, others pretending not to watch. "My husband was a police detective." Sarah's voice dropped to a hiss. "He died protecting this community from people like you." Michael's breath caught. He recognized her now. Sarah Thompson. Her husband's death during the riots had been all over the news. He'd even considered taking on a civil rights case related to that night, but his caseload had been too heavy. "Mrs. Thompson," he said softly, I'm sorry for your loss, but this isn't about your husband. It's just a parking spot. Why don't we both—" "Don't you dare say his name." Sarah's voice rose hysterically. "You have no right, none of you have any right, coming into our neighborhoods, taking our spaces, our jobs, our—" She choked on the words, tears starting in her eyes. A small crowd had gathered now. Michael saw phones being raised, recording. He needed to defuse this situation fast. "Mrs. Thompson, please, let's not do this here. I'll move my car if it means that much to you." "Now you want to move? Now?" Sarah's face contorted. "It's too late for that. It's always too late with you people. You push and push until everything breaks, and then you act innocent when someone finally pushes back." She stepped closer, her grief-twisted face inches from his. Michael could smell expensive perfume and something medicinal. A hospital antiseptic, maybe. He started to step back to give her space when her hand shot out. The slap echoed across the parking lot like a gunshot. The sting of Sarah's slap radiated across Michael's cheek, but it was the collective gasp from the onlookers that truly burned. Smartphones recorded from every angle as he stood there, a Harvard-educated public defender being assaulted in broad daylight over a parking space. His mother's voice echoed in his mind. Justice without compassion is just another form of violence. But before he could process the situation, Sarah's voice cut through his thoughts. What are you going to do about it? Hit me back? Show everyone who you really are? Michael's hand moved instinctively, not in rage, but in defensive reflex, delivering a controlled slap that barely grazed her cheek. The moment his hand made contact, he knew he'd made a tactical error, one that would haunt him in ways he couldn't yet imagine. "Attacked me!" Sarah screamed, her voice carrying across the parking lot. "Did everyone see that? The black man attacked me. Someone call the police." The crowd's reaction was immediate and predictable. Phones that had been recording discreetly were now raised openly. A white man in a golf shirt stepped forward, positioning himself between Michael and Sarah. Two teenage boys backed away, already dialing 911. "Mrs. Thompson," Michael said, forcing his voice to remain steady. "The cameras saw you strike first. Let's not make this worse than it..." "Worse?" Sarah's laugh was almost maniacal. "You have no idea what worse is. You think you can just waltz into Oak Hill with your fancy suit and your law degree and..." She stopped suddenly, her eyes narrowing as she spotted his public defender parking pass. "Wait, you're one of those bleeding heart lawyers who defends criminals, aren't you?" Michael watched understanding dawn on her face, followed by something darker. She reached into her purse, hands trembling. "My husband died protecting this community," she said, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "He died because of lawyers like you, letting thugs back onto our streets. And now you dare to put your hands on me?" She pulled out her phone, fingers flying across the screen. "Robert?" "Yes, it's Sarah. I'm at the Grove Street Market. There's a situation?" "Yes, that kind of situation. He's one of those public defenders." Michael's stomach tightened. Chief Robert Anderson, her late husband's partner. The same police chief whose department was currently under investigation for racial profiling, though the case had mysteriously stalled in the courts. "Ma'am," Michael tried one last time, "we can resolve this reasonably." But Sarah was already walking back to her SUV, a triumphant smile playing at her lips. As she passed his Toyota, she accidentally dragged her keys along its side, leaving a deep gash in the paint. "Oops," she said sweetly, loud enough for the cameras to hear. "Guess you should have just stayed in your own neighborhood." In the distance, police sirens began to wail. Michael stood beside his vandalized car, watching his carefully constructed world begin to unravel, unaware that this was only the beginning of a confrontation that would expose far darker secrets than either of them knew. This powerful story of Michael's dignity in the face of injustice deserves a like, but sadly no one has hit that button yet. Let's show our support for those who stand strong against discrimination. The fluorescent lights of Springfield General Hospital cast harsh shadows as Michael sat in the waiting room, holding an ice pack to his swollen cheek. Despite Sarah Thompson's accusations, the responding officers recognizing him from the courthouse had been professional, taking statements from multiple witnesses who confirmed she struck first. Mr. Jennings, a familiar voice called. Dr. Patricia Walker, his mother's oncologist, hurried toward him, her face drawn with concern. "I was just about to call you. Your mother." Michael stood quickly, his heart racing. "Is she?" "She's stable," Dr. Walker assured him, "but her latest blood work is concerning. She needs a transfusion immediately," but she hesitated. "But what?" "Your mother has a rare blood type, and our current supply is critically low. We've put out requests to other hospitals, but..." A commotion down the hall interrupted them. Medical staff rushed past, pushing a gurney. Michael caught a glimpse of a young girl, pale and unconscious, her blonde hair fanned out on the pillow. Behind the gurney, following in near hysteria, was Sarah Thompson. "Please, you have to help her." Sarah's voice cracked with desperation. She just collapsed at home. Her blood pressure. "Get her to room 4, Dr. Walker called out, already moving. "Mr. Jennings, I'm sorry, I have to." "Go," Michael nodded, watching as the doctor rushed after the gurney. He sank back into his chair, mind racing. His mother needed blood, and somewhere in this same hospital, the daughter of the woman who had just assaulted him was fighting her own battle. The irony wasn't lost on him. 20 minutes later, Dr. Walker returned, looking exhausted. She dropped into the chair beside Michael. "Both cases," she said quietly. "Both your mother and Emma Thompson. They both need the same rare blood type, and we don't have enough for either of them. Michael's head snapped up. Emma Thompson. Sarah Thompson's daughter. She has a rare blood disorder. We've been treating her since Dr. Walker paused. Since her father died. The stress of his death likely triggered the condition. Michael closed his eyes, remembering Sarah's words in the parking lot. My husband died protecting this community. He'd dismissed it as racist rhetoric, but now. Doctor, he said slowly, I have the same blood type as my mother. Dr. Walker's eyes widened. You do? But that's rare. Yes, I know, because 6 months ago I donated blood here. Someone said it helped save a young girl's life. The doctor's face went pale. Mr. Jennings, that young girl was Emma Thompson. Your blood donation is what kept her alive after her first crisis. The weight of this revelation settled over Michael like a heavy blanket. Somewhere in this hospital, Sarah Thompson was sitting beside her daughter's bed, probably still seething with hatred toward him, unaware that his blood ran through her child's veins. How much blood do you need? He asked quietly. Mr. Jennings, Dr. Walker touched his arm. After what happened today, no one would blame you if. How much? Ma, to treat both your mother and Emma? More than we could safely take from one donor. Michael nodded slowly. Then we have to choose. Dr. Walker's pager buzzed. She checked it and stood quickly. Emma's crashing. I have to go. Mr. Jennings, I'm so sorry, but we need a decision quickly. As she hurried away, Michael sat alone in the harsh hospital light, facing an impossible choice. Save his mother, who had sacrificed everything for him, or save the daughter of a woman who had just assaulted him, a young girl who was innocent of her mother's prejudices. In his pocket, his phone buzzed with a text from Chief Anderson, stay away from the Thompsons, or that assault charge might stick after all. The choice had just become even more complicated. Chief Robert Anderson stood in the hospital security room, his imposing figure reflected in the bank of monitors. Delete the footage, he ordered, sliding an envelope across to the security guard. All of it. Parking lot, emergency room entrance, everything from the last 2 hours. Sir, the guard hesitated. That's against protocol. Protocol? Anderson's laugh was cold. Son, do you know how many violations I could find in your background check? Those marijuana charges from college that mysteriously disappeared. As the security footage was being erased, Michael sat in the hospital chapel, his phone open to his mother's smiling photo. The choice before him seemed impossible. Use his rare blood to save his mother, or save Emma Thompson and face the consequences from Chief Anderson. His phone buzzed again. A young officer, David Miller, one of the responding officers from the parking lot, had sent him a video. Watch this. Recorded it myself before the chief arrived. Be careful who you trust. The video showed Sarah Thompson's initial assault, but more importantly, it captured her phone call to Anderson. ... Need you to handle this, Robert, like you handled those body cam files from James's last night. Michael's breath caught. James Thompson's death during the riots there had always been questions about missing footage, about why a decorated officer was in plainclothes in that neighborhood. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. Officer Miller stood in the chapel doorway, nervously glancing over his shoulder. Mr. Jennings, he said quietly, there's something you need to know. The night Detective Thompson died, he wasn't just evacuating that family, he was meeting a journalist. Something about evidence of departmental corruption. Why are you telling me this? Because Miller swallowed hard. Chief Anderson was there too. And the body cam footage that went missing, it showed Thompson arguing with Anderson, not rioters. Michael's legal mind raced with implications. You're saying? I'm saying choose carefully who you save today, Mr. Jennings. The chief isn't protecting Sarah Thompson out of loyalty to her husband. He's keeping her close because she doesn't know the truth about James's death. As if on cue, Michael's phone buzzed with another text from Anderson. Final warning. Walk away, or those assault charges won't be the only ones you face. The chief's deleting hospital security footage right now, Miller added. He's trying to erase any evidence connecting today's events to the department. But I've got copies. And he hesitated. I know where Thompson's missing body cam footage is. Michael stood, decision crystallizing. Officer Miller, my mother needs blood, type AB negative. Can you get her transferred to County General? Quietly. Miller nodded. What are you going to do? I'm going to donate blood to save Emma Thompson, Michael said, heading for the door. And then I'm going to find out what really happened the night James Thompson died. That's suicide, Miller called after him. The chief will. The chief will do exactly what I expect him to do, Michael turned back. He'll try to bury the truth. But sometimes he thought of his mother's words. Sometimes justice needs a sacrifice to shine light on the darkness. As Michael walked toward the blood bank, he passed Sarah Thompson in the hallway. She was crying, pleading with a nurse about Emma's condition. For a moment, their eyes met. Her face twisted with recognition and hatred, but Michael saw something else there too, the desperate fear of a mother about to lose her child. He reached the blood bank counter just as his phone buzzed one final time. Another text from Anderson, your mother's medical insurance claim just got denied. Shame how paperwork gets lost sometimes. Last chance, Jennings, walk away. Michael handed his ID to the nurse. I'm here to donate for Emma Thompson. The headlines exploded across Springfield the next morning. Black lawyer assaults police widow, shocking video shows violence in upscale neighborhood. The carefully edited footage, released anonymously to local media, showed only Michael's retaliatory slap, conveniently missing Sarah's initial assault. In his law office, Michael sat across from James Cooper, his longtime friend and fellow attorney. The morning sun cast long shadows across Cooper's mahogany desk, much like the shadows now falling across their 15-year friendship. They're pressing charges, Michael Cooper said, not meeting his eyes. Assault, harassment, and now Chief Anderson's added intimidation of a witness because of your hospital visit. You know, that's bulls. What I know, Cooper interrupted, is that you're toxic right now. The firm's partners had an emergency meeting this morning. We can't represent you. Michael leaned forward. Jim, we've known each other since law school. You were my daughter's godfather before Karen took her in the divorce. You know me. Do I? Cooper's voice hardened. Because the Michael I knew wouldn't have slapped a white woman in broad daylight. Do you have any idea what this could do to the firm's reputation? Before Michael could respond, his phone buzzed. County General Hospital, his mother's transfer had been denied. Her insurance was still mysteriously under review. Your mother's cancer treatments, Cooper said quietly. The firm's been helping with those bills, hasn't it? The threat was clear. Michael felt the walls closing in. So that's it? 15 years of friendship thrown away because of politics. Politics, Cooper laughed bitterly. This isn't about politics. This is about survival. Chief Anderson called the managing partners personally. He mentioned our pending contracts with the police department, our oversight committee positions. He slid a document across the desk. Sign it. Michael glanced at the paper, a confession, admitting to assaulting Sarah Thompson without provocation. If you sign, Cooper continued, the charges get reduced. You'll serve community service, keep your law license. The firm will continue paying your mother's medical bills. Everyone wins. Everyone except Justice. Justice Cooper stood, anger finally breaking through his professional veneer. Wake up, Michael. You're a black man who hit a white woman in Oak Hill. There is no justice here. There's only damage control. A commotion outside interrupted them. Through the office windows, Michael saw police cars pulling up. Officer Miller was among them, his face grim. The young officer had warned him this was coming. Last chance, Cooper said, holding out a pen. Sign it. Michael stood straightening his tie. You know what's ironic, Jim? Yesterday I gave blood to save Sarah Thompson's daughter. The same blood type that saved her 6 months ago. I chose to help her child instead of my own mother, because I still believed in doing what's right. He headed for the door. I guess we know now whose blood really runs cold. Michael, please. But Michael was already opening the door, hands raised as officers approached with handcuffs. Michael Jennings, Chief Anderson's voice boomed through the office. You're under arrest for assault, harassment, and intimidation of a witness, he smiled coldly. And I'm afraid we just found cocaine in your car. That's impossible. Search warrant says otherwise. Anderson nodded to his officers. Book him. As they led him out in handcuffs, Michael saw Sarah Thompson watching from across the street. She wasn't smiling triumphantly like he expected. Instead, she looked uncertain, confused by the scale of response to what had started as a parking lot dispute. Their eyes met briefly. Michael could have shouted out the truth about her daughter, about his blood donation, about his mother, but he remembered James Thompson's last night, his mysterious meeting with a journalist, and Chief Anderson's desperate attempts to bury the truth. Sometimes silence was the best weapon. In the police car, Officer Miller whispered, Your mother's been transferred successfully. County General just confirmed. Michael nodded slightly. At least she was safe from Anderson's reach. As they drove away, his phone buzzed one final time in the evidence bag. A text from an unknown number found Thompson's body cam footage. Meeting your mother's nurse tonight. Stay strong. The pieces were moving. But as they headed toward the station, Michael couldn't shake the image of Sarah Thompson's face, not her rage from the parking lot, but her confusion outside his office. She didn't know she was just a pawn in Anderson's game. She didn't know her husband had died trying to expose the very corruption now destroying Michael's life. Your daughter, Miller said quietly from the front seat. Emma's responding well to the transfusion. The doctors are optimistic. Michael closed his eyes. Sometimes justice demanded sacrifice. Sometimes the truth needed time to bleed out, one drop at a time. As they pulled into the station, he silently recited his mother's words, justice without compassion is just another form of violence. In the pediatric ward of Springfield General, Emma Thompson sat up in bed, color finally returning to her cheeks. The transfusion had worked miracles, just like the mysterious donation 6 months ago. She watched her mother pacing the room, phone pressed to her ear. Yes, Robert, I understand, Sarah was saying, her voice strained. But they're saying formal charges? Drug possession? For a parking lot dispute. Emma scrolled through her phone, reading news headlines about Michael's arrest. Something didn't add up. She'd seen the full video before it was taken down, the original one showing her mother striking first. Now, every news outlet was running a different version. Mom, Emma called softly. Why did you do it? Sarah ended her call, turning to her daughter. Do what, sweetie? Hit that man. He wasn't doing anything wrong. Emma, you don't understand. People like him. People like him, Emma's voice sharpened. Dad always said judging people by their skin color was wrong, he said. Don't, Sarah snapped. Don't you dare use your father's words against me. That man assaulted me. After you hit him first, Emma countered. I saw the original video before it disappeared, just like Dad's body cam footage disappeared. Sarah froze. What are you talking about? I heard you and Uncle Robert talking last month about missing footage from the night Dad died. About keeping stories straight. Emma's hands clutched her blanket. Mom, what really happened to Dad? Before Sarah could respond, a nurse entered with Emma's charts. Good news. Your blood work is excellent. The donor's blood type was a perfect match, just like last time. Last time, Sarah asked. Oh yes, 6 months ago. Same donor, actually. It's rare to find Abe negative, but who Sarah interrupted. "Who's the donor?" The nurse hesitated. "I'm not supposed to." But given the circumstances, it was Mr. Jennings, both times. Sarah sank into a chair, the color draining from her face. The man she'd assaulted, the man now facing jail time because of her accusations, had saved her daughter's life. Twice. "Mom," Emma's voice was quiet. "Why would he do that?" "Save me, I mean, after what you did to him." Sarah's phone buzzed another text from Chief Anderson. "Press conference in an hour. Stick to the script." She stared at the message, feeling sick. "He did it," Emma continued, "because that's what Dad would have done. Right, Mom? Dad always said help people first, ask questions later." Sarah's hands began to shake. James would be ashamed of her. She'd let grief twist her into someone he wouldn't recognize. And now an innocent man, a man who'd saved their daughter, was facing prison because of her lies. "I have to fix this," she whispered. Mrs. Thompson, Officer Miller appeared in the doorway. "May I speak with you?" "About your husband's last night." Sarah noticed he wasn't in uniform. His expression was grave, urgent. Behind him, through the hospital window, she could see news vans arriving for the press conference. "Emma, sweetie," Sarah touched her daughter's hand. "I need to talk to Officer Miller. Then I'm going to do what your father would have wanted, what he died trying to do." "Tell the truth," Emma asked softly. Sarah nodded, tears filling her eyes. "Tell the truth." As she followed Miller into the hallway, her phone buzzed again. "Anderson, remember who pays Emma's medical bills. Don't get heroic." But Sarah wasn't listening anymore. In her mind, she heard James's last words again. "These people aren't our enemies, honey. They're just scared, like us. We've got to do better." Miller led her to a quiet corner and pulled out a USB drive. "Mrs. Thompson, there's something you need to see. It's footage from your husband's body cam. The real footage." Sarah's heart pounded. "How did you?" "Let's just say Mr. Jennings isn't the only one tired of watching justice bleed out in this town." As Miller plugged the drive into his laptop, Sarah thought of Michael Jennings sitting in a jail cell, charged with crimes he didn't commit, while his blood literally ran through her daughter's veins. She thought of James, his final act of courage now buried under years of lies and corruption. "Before we watch this," Miller said quietly, "you should know your husband was a hero, just not in the way they told you." Sarah squared her shoulders, channeling James's strength. "Show me everything." In the pediatric ward, Emma watched news crews setting up outside. Her phone buzzed with a notification someone had posted new footage of the parking lot incident, the full version. She hit share, then typed, "My name is Emma Thompson. Here's what really happened to my dad's killer's lawyer." Sometimes the truth needed a child's courage to break free. The press conference was about to begin, but a different story was already spreading through Springfield's social media. The real story was finally bleeding out, one truth at a time. The police station's press conference room buzzed with anticipation. Chief Anderson stood at the podium, Sarah Thompson seated dutifully beside him, her face a careful mask. Cameras flashed as he began his prepared statement. 3 years ago, we lost a hero, Detective James Thompson, during a night of senseless violence. Today, we face another attack on law enforcement, as a public defender with a history of anti-police activism. That's a lie. The voice cut through the room like a thunderbolt. Sarah Thompson had risen from her chair, her hands trembling but her voice clear. Mrs. Thompson, Anderson warned quietly, "Remember our discussion." "My husband was a hero," Sarah continued, her voice growing stronger, "but not because he died protecting us from rioters. He died protecting us from you, Robert." The room erupted. Reporters leaned forward, cameras whirring. Anderson's face darkened as Sarah pulled out her phone, holding it up. I just watched the real body cam footage, the one you tried to bury, the one that shows you and James arguing behind that store, the one that shows your gun firing." Anderson lunged for the podium microphone, but Officer Miller was faster, switching it back on. The chief's desperate grab was captured by dozens of cameras. "My husband Sarah's voice, cracked with emotion, discovered evidence of corruption. Drug money, planted evidence, falsified arrests. He was meeting a journalist that night." "But you followed him, didn't you, Robert?" Sarah Anderson's voice was dangerously low. "Think about Emma. Think about her medical bills." "I am thinking about Emma," Sarah shouted. "I'm thinking about the man whose blood saved her life, twice the same man you're framing for drug possession. The same man her voice broke, the same man I assaulted because you convinced me people like him were the enemy." She turned to the cameras. "Michael Jennings didn't assault me. I attacked him. I was angry, grieving, and Chief Anderson used that. He used my grief to cover up what really happened to James." Anderson moved toward her, but uniformed officers led by Miller stepped between them. "You're experiencing trauma," Sarah Anderson said loudly for the cameras. "You're confused." "Play the footage," Sarah challenged. "Show everyone what happened that night. Show them how James begged you to come clean. Show them." A commotion at the back of the room interrupted her. Emma Thompson was being wheeled in by a nurse, her hospital gown stark against the dark suits of the press corps. "Show them this," Emma called out, holding up her phone. Her social media post had already gone viral. The full parking lot video, combined with snippets of her father's recovered body cam footage. "Your own goddaughter," Sarah's voice trembled with rage. "You let me believe lies about James's death while your corruption almost killed her. If Michael Jennings hadn't donated blood." "Enough," Anderson roared, reaching inside his jacket. Several things happened at once. Officers drew their weapons. Reporters dove for cover. Miller stepped in front of Sarah and Emma. And through the chaos, a new voice rang out. "The FBI has some questions about that night, Chief Anderson." Special Agent Diana Martinez strode into the room, flanked by federal agents. Behind her, Michael Jennings walked in, freed from his cell but still in handcuffs. Mr. Jennings's mother, Martinez announced, worked as a forensic accountant before her illness. She spent the last 3 years secretly gathering evidence about departmental corruption, evidence her son delivered to us last night, along with Officer Miller's footage. Anderson's face contorted. "You have no jurisdiction." "We do when the corruption crosses state lines," Martinez smiled coldly. "When drug money moves through multiple departments, when evidence disappears across jurisdictions, when a decorated detective is murdered for threatening to expose it all." She nodded to an agent, who began reading Anderson his rights. But the chief wasn't finished. With surprising speed, he drew his weapon, pointing it at Sarah. "You think this changes anything?" he snarled. "You think these people care about truth? About justice? They just want a story. A narrative. And I'm making sure it ends my way." "No," Uncle Robert, Emma's voice was quiet but firm. "It ends with the truth. Like Dad wanted." She held up her phone again, but this time it wasn't playing footage. It was live streaming everything happening in the room. Thousands were watching as Anderson pointed his gun at a widow whose husband he'd killed. "Your goddaughter, Robert," Sarah said softly. "James's daughter. Are you going to shoot me in front of her too?" The room held its breath. Anderson's hand wavered. In that moment of hesitation, Miller and the other officers moved. The chief's gun clattered to the floor as they took him down. As agents led Anderson away, Sarah walked to Michael, still in handcuffs. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "For everything." Michael looked at Emma, then back at Sarah. "Your husband tried to do what was right. In the end, so did you." But as reporters swarmed around them and cameras flashed, Michael knew this wasn't over. Anderson wasn't the only corrupt official in Springfield. And somewhere in the city, his mother was still fighting for her life, her medical bills still unpaid. The truth was out, but Justice's price was far from settled. The scene at County General Hospital's oncology ward was a stark contrast to the chaos at the police station. Michael sat beside his mother's bed, the TV muted but showing repeated footage of Anderson's arrest. His handcuffs had been removed, but the weight of what came next pressed heavily on his shoulders. "You're brooding again," Helen Jennings said weakly, touching her son's hand, "just like your father used to." "Mom, Let me guess," she smiled faintly. "You're worried about retaliation from Anderson's allies, about my medical bills, about Sarah Thompson and her daughter." Before Michael could respond, a commotion erupted in the hallway. Sarah Thompson's voice carried through the door, arguing with hospital security. "Please, I need to see him. I have to." "Let her," and Helen called out, surprising Michael. Sarah entered hesitantly, clutching a thick manila envelope. Her eyes widened at Helen's condition, the same cancer-ravaged frame she'd seen in Emma during her worst days. "Mrs. Jennings," Sarah's voice cracked. "Mr. Jennings, she paused, gathering courage. "I brought this." She held out the envelope. "It's everything. James's life insurance, his pension, the settlement from the department. It should cover your medical treatments and then some." "Mrs. Thompson," Michael started. "Please," Sarah interrupted. "Your blood saved my daughter. Twice. She choked back tears. While I was destroying your life, you were saving hers. And your mother. She spent 3 years gathering evidence, knowing it could help solve James's murder. Even after what I did to you." Helen's monitor beeped steadily as she studied Sarah. "Grief makes strangers of us all, dear. The question is, who do we choose to become after the grief?" Suddenly, the monitor started screaming. Helen's body seized, her eyes rolling back. Medical staff rushed in as Michael was pushed aside. Through the chaos, he heard fragments crashing. "Need blood, immediately, type match." Sarah grabbed his arm. "Emma and I are both matches. We already checked. Let us." "No," Michael cut her off. "Your daughter's still recovering. And you—" He looked at the mother of the girl he'd helped save, the widow of a man who died fighting corruption, the woman who'd assaulted him in a parking lot lifetime ago. "You need to finish what you started. There's going to be blowback from Anderson's allies. Emma needs you strong." "Then what?" Officer Miller appeared in the doorway, out of breath. "Got your message. I'm Abe negative too. Let's do this." As Miller was prepped for the transfusion, Sarah watched Michael with his mother, seeing for the first time the same love and fear she felt for Emma. Her phone buzzed the district attorney's office. They wanted her testimony about Anderson, about James's death, about everything. "Michael," she said softly, "Anderson wasn't working alone. The DA, the oversight committee, half the department, they're all involved. They'll come after you after your practice." "Let 'em come," Michael replied, not taking his eyes off his mother. "You don't understand. They're already moving. Your law license, your clients, your reputation." Actually, a new voice joined them. "They're not." James Cooper stood in the doorway, looking ashamed but determined. Behind him were several senior partners from Michael's firm. The managing partners, Cooper continued, would like to announce their full support for Mr. Jennings, along with a formal apology and reinstatement. With a significant raise, he handed Michael a flash drive, plus some interesting records about judicial misconduct we've been collecting. Sarah stared at Cooper. "Why now?" "Because," Cooper looked at Michael, "someone reminded me that justice without courage is just compliance." He turned back to Sarah. "Also, Mrs. Thompson, your husband's journalist contact, she finally published her story. All of it. Every corrupt judge, every tainted case, every dirty cop. It's over." The monitors stabilized as Helen received Miller's blood. Michael felt tears of relief threatening, but there was one more thing he needed to know. "Sarah," he said quietly, "why did you really come here?" She pulled out her phone, showing him Emma's social media feed. His eyes widened as he read Day 1 of Justice for James Thompson Foundation, providing legal support to victims of racial profiling and police misconduct. In memory of my dad, who died fighting corruption, and in honor of Michael Jennings, who showed me what real courage looks like. "She's 15, Sarah whispered, "and she's already braver than I ever was." Helen's voice, weak but clear, carried across the room. Sometimes the youngest hearts see the clearest path to justice. As if on cue, Emma wheeled herself in, carrying a familiar jazz record one Michael had sold to pay for his mother's treatments. "Found this at a store," she smiled. "Dad had the same one. He used to say music was the only language that never lied." Michael took the record, remembering late nights with his father, jazz playing softly as they discussed cases, justice, and the price of doing what's right. The monitors beeped steadily now. Outside, reporters were gathering again. The story wasn't over, it was just beginning. But as Michael looked around the room at Miller donating blood, at Cooper choosing redemption, at Sarah and Emma choosing truth over comfort, he realized something. Justice wasn't just about winning cases. Sometimes it was about healing wounds, one truthful moment at a time. If this story of justice, redemption, and healing moved you like it moved us, please consider subscribing to our channel. Every subscription helps us continue sharing powerful stories that shine a light on important social issues. Together, we can make a difference. The victory at the press conference proved short-lived. 3 days later, Michael stood in the ICU, watching helplessly as doctors fought to save both his mother and Emma Thompson. The transfusion had triggered an unexpected complication, a rare reaction that sent both patients into critical condition. The same blood that had created their connection was now threatening both their lives. "We don't understand it," Dr. Walker explained, her voice heavy with exhaustion. "The initial transfusions worked perfectly, but something's changed. Their bodies are rejecting new blood, and without more transfusions—" She left the sentence unfinished, but the implication hung heavy in the air. Sarah paced the hallway between the two ICU rooms, her face drawn with guilt and fear. The monitors in both rooms beeped in an almost synchronized rhythm of distress. The sight of Helen Jennings and Emma lying in adjacent rooms, both fighting for their lives because of a chain of events she had set in motion, was almost unbearable. Michael hadn't left the hospital in days. His suit was wrinkled, his eyes red from lack of sleep. The expose on police corruption had sparked investigations across 3 states, but none of that mattered now. The truth had come out. Anderson was in custody. But the price of justice was proving steeper than anyone had imagined. "There's an experimental treatment," Dr. Walker offered tentatively. "A new protocol for blood rejection cases. But insurance won't cover it, and given the risks," she glanced between Michael and Sarah, "we'd need consent from both families. If it fails, we could lose them both immediately." The cruel irony wasn't lost on anyone. 2 families, torn apart by racism and corruption, now faced the same impossible choice. The same blood ran through their veins, and the same treatment could save or kill them both. Officer Miller arrived with news from the investigation, but stopped short when he saw their faces. "What happened?" "The universe has a sick sense of humor," Michael said quietly. "All this started with blood, my blood, saving Emma. Now," he turned to Sarah, his voice breaking slightly, "your husband died trying to expose corruption. My mother spent years gathering evidence to finish what he started. And now we might lose them both because their bodies are rejecting the very thing that brought us all together." Sarah sank into a chair, her shoulders shaking. "I did this," she whispered. "If I hadn't attacked you that day, if I hadn't let Anderson manipulate my grief—" "Stop!" Michael cut her off. "This isn't about blame anymore. We have to decide, do we risk the experimental treatment?" Before anyone could respond, alarms blared from both rooms. Medical teams rushed in as Emma and Helen's vitals crashed simultaneously. Dr. Walker shouted orders as Michael and Sarah watched in horror, each unable to enter their loved one's room due to the chaos of emergency response. In that moment, standing in the hospital hallway while both their worlds threatened to collapse, Michael and Sarah found themselves shoulder to shoulder, united by the same fear, the same hope, the same impossible choice. "The treatment," Sarah said suddenly, grabbing Michael's arm. "We have to try it. It's what James would have done, what your mother would want." Michael looked at her, really looked at her, and saw not the angry woman from the parking lot, but a mother terrified of losing her child, just as he was terrified of losing his mother. "Both of them," he nodded, "together, whatever happens." As they signed the consent forms, neither knew they were about to face an even more devastating revelation, one that would shake the foundations of everything they thought they knew about that fateful night 3 years ago. As the experimental treatment began, James Cooper burst into the ICU, clutching a weathered manila envelope, his face ashen. "Michael, Sarah, you need to see this. Now!" The envelope contained James Thompson's personal journal, found hidden in an old case file during the corruption investigation. What they read shattered their world completely. The night James Thompson died, he wasn't just meeting a journalist. He was meeting Helen Jennings. The entries revealed a devastating truth. Helen had been James's confidential informant for months, helping him build a case against Anderson and the corrupt system. But there was more. Medical records, DNA tests, correspondence that pointed to an impossible connection. Emma Thompson wasn't just saved by Michael's blood, she shared it. A secret affair during college, a child given up for adoption, a chance for union years later orchestrated by fate and sealed in blood. Sarah collapsed against the wall as the truth hit her. Her daughter, the one thing she thought she knew for certain in this world, had been adopted. Her biological parents were James Thompson and Helen Jennings. The racial hatred she'd harbored, the man she'd assaulted in the parking lot, he was her daughter's half-brother. "She was protecting her," Michael whispered, understanding dawning in his eyes. "All these years, my mother was gathering evidence, not just for justice, but to protect Emma, her granddaughter." The weight of this revelation crushed the air from his lungs. His mother had watched him donate blood to save his own sister, never revealing the truth, carrying the burden alone. The hospital alarms chose that moment to scream again. Both patients were crashing, their bodies rejecting the experimental treatment. As medical teams rushed in, Dr. Walker emerged with tears in her eyes. "We're losing them both. You need to say goodbye." Michael and Sarah stood frozen, the journal between them containing a truth too heavy to bear. Their families had been intertwined long before that parking lot confrontation, bound by secrets, sacrifice, and blood. Now, as both Helen and Emma slipped away, the full tragedy of their prejudices and assumptions threatened to destroy everything. She never told me," Sarah sobbed, clutching the journal. "James never... How could they keep this secret? All these years I've been hating the very people who were protecting my daughter." The irony was unbearable. Her racist assault had targeted her daughter's own brother, while her husband's murderer had been her daughter's protector all along. Koopa cleared his throat. There's more. Anderson knew. He discovered the truth while investigating James. That's why Helen had to be discredited if she ever came forward. That's why he pushed so hard to destroy Michael after the parking lot incident. He wasn't just covering up corruption. He was bearing a truth that would expose decades of lies. Through the ICU windows, they watched the medical teams working frantically to save both patients, mother and daughter. Their lives hanging by a thread, connected by blood that was both saving and destroying them. The truth had finally come out, but the cost was proving too high. "What have I done?" Sarah whispered, watching her daughter's vitals plummet. All this time, the real enemy wasn't race or corruption. It was our own blindness, our own hate. Michael couldn't respond. He was watching his mother, the woman who had sacrificed everything to protect a granddaughter she could never claim, who had carried the weight of this secret through years of fighting cancer and corruption. Now, in cruel cosmic irony, both she and Emma might pay the ultimate price for the truth finally coming to light. The machines continued their mournful beeping, counting down moments that felt like final heartbeats of a tragedy decades in the making. In the darkest hour of the ICU, as both patients hovered between life and death, Officer Miller rushed in with a discovery that would change everything. He had found an old photo in James Thompson's personal effects at the evidence locker, a faded Polaroid from a medical conference 20 years ago. It showed Helen Jennings and James Thompson standing together, both wearing conference badges, both smiling. The date on the photo predated Emma's birth by exactly 9 months. But it was what lay behind the photo that proved most crucial. Hidden in its backing was a letter, never sent, from James to Helen, dated just days before his death. "I've found a way to protect both our daughter and my family," he'd written. Anderson's corruption goes deeper than anyone knows. He's been running a pharmaceutical testing scheme through the hospitals, falsifying blood work to cover illegal trials. The same trials that might have caused Emma's condition. I'm meeting with the FBI tomorrow. Helen, if anything happens to me, the evidence is in the one place Anderson would never look. Sarah's old music box, the one that plays our song. Sarah's hands trembled as she read the letter, the music box. She'd kept it all these years untouched on her dresser, too painful to open after James's death. Now she understood why he'd insisted she never get rid of it, why he'd made her promise to keep it safe. Even in death, he'd been protecting both his families. Michael made the connection first. The blood reactions, he said urgently to Dr. Walker. Could they be related to illegal drug trials? To tainted blood supplies? The doctor's eyes widened as she quickly accessed old hospital records. There were unusual markers in both patients' blood work from years ago. We assumed they were natural anomalies, but if they were exposed to experimental drugs, she turned to her team. Get me every record of Anderson's pharmaceutical connections. Now. As medical staff rushed to investigate, Sarah remembered something else. How Anderson had always insisted Emma receive treatments only at specific hospitals, with specific doctors. How he'd used her medical bills as leverage to keep Sarah quiet. The pieces were falling into place with devastating clarity. The truth hit them like a thunderbolt. Anderson hadn't just killed James to cover up police corruption. He'd killed him to hide a massive pharmaceutical testing conspiracy, one that had inadvertently connected two families through tainted blood and hidden DNA. Emma's condition, Helen's cancer, they weren't random illnesses. They were the results of illegal drug trials covered up by years of falsified records and corrupt officials. Miller's phone buzzed with an urgent update from the FBI investigation. They'd found a network of offshore accounts linking Anderson to several pharmaceutical companies that had been conducting unauthorized drug trials through the hospital system for years. The same companies that had provided the blood products, now threatening both Helen and Emma's lives. The revelation offered both hope and horror. If they could identify the specific compounds used in their trials, they might be able to save both patients. But it also meant facing an even larger conspiracy, one that reached far beyond Springfield's police department into the highest levels of corporate and medical power. The race to uncover the truth had become a race to save lives, and somewhere in Sarah Thompson's house, an old music box held the final pieces of evidence that could bring it all crashing down. Sarah's hands shook as she unlocked her front door, Michael and Miller close behind. The music box sat exactly where it had for 3 years, gathering dust on her dresser. Its ornate surface seemed to mock them with its innocence, a delicate witness to years of devastating secrets. When she finally wound the key, the melody that played wasn't the lullaby she remembered. Instead, the off-key notes revealed a hidden mysteries of desperation, loss, and odd. Inside lay a USB drive and a handwritten letter that would shatter the last remnants of everything they thought they knew. James Thompson hadn't just uncovered evidence of pharmaceutical testing. He'd discovered that Anderson and his corporate partners had been deliberately targeting minority communities for their illegal trials, using the police department to cover their tracks. The corrupted blood supply had affected hundreds of families, all while Anderson used his position to ensure the victims could never seek justice. But the most shocking revelation came from Helen's sealed testimony stored on the USB drive. She and James hadn't had a brief affair. They'd been working together for years, gathering evidence while falling in love. Emma's adoption hadn't been random. It had been orchestrated to protect her from Anderson's retaliation. Helen had given up her daughter and maintained her distance, knowing that exposing the truth too soon would put both Emma and Sarah at risk. She'd chosen to watch her daughter grow up from afar, channeling her pain into a years-long quest for justice. The evidence was comprehensive: hospital records, offshore account details, internal emails, and surveillance footage. James and Helen had built an airtight case against not just Anderson, but an entire network of corrupt officials and corporate executives. The night James died, he wasn't just meeting Helen. They were planning to take everything to the FBI together. Anderson had killed him to stop both the evidence and the truth about Emma from coming out. As they rushed back to the hospital with their discoveries, Sarah finally understood the full weight of her actions. Her hatred, her racism, and her assault on Michael. She hadn't just attacked an innocent man. She'd been manipulated into becoming a weapon against the very people who'd sacrificed everything to protect her and her daughter. The parking lot confrontation hadn't been random. Anderson had deliberately inflamed her grief and prejudices, knowing she would help him discredit the one family that could expose his crimes. The final piece clicked into place when they reached the ICU. Dr. Walker had found the connection between Helen's cancer and Emma's blood condition. Both were rare side effects of an experimental drug that had been secretly tested in Springfield's minority communities. the same drug that had made them particularly vulnerable to blood transfusion complications. Anderson hadn't just covered up crimes, he'd created a medical time bomb that was still claiming victims. The truth had finally emerged, but time was running out. Both Helen and Emma were critical, their bodies fighting not just illness, but the toxic legacy of Anderson's conspiracy. As medical teams worked frantically to develop an antidote, Michael and Sarah faced the ultimate test of their newfound understanding, working together to save both their families while bringing down the corrupt system that had torn them apart. The music box's melody had stopped playing, but its revelations were just beginning to resonate through the halls of power in Springfield. The Springfield County Cards had never seen a day quite like this. The gallery was packed as Michael Jennings, no longer in handcuffs but wearing his attorney's badge with renewed purpose, presented the evidence found in Sarah Thompson's music box. Judge Patricia Martinez, specially appointed after half the local judiciary had been implicated in Anderson's conspiracy, listened with growing outrage as the full scope of the corruption was revealed. Sarah Thompson's testimony proved devastating. She described how Anderson had manipulated her grief, using her as an unwitting pawn in his scheme to discredit Michael and Helen. Her voice broke only once, when she looked directly at Michael and publicly apologized for her racist assault, acknowledging how her prejudice had made her vulnerable to manipulation. The pharmaceutical company executives squirmed in their seats as their internal emails were read aloud, revealing their deliberate targeting of minority communities for illegal drug trials. Anderson, watching from his defendant's chair, had aged decades in custody, his arrogance replaced by the hollow-eyed look of a man seeing his empire crumble. But the most powerful moment came when Emma Thompson took the stand. Now recovered thanks to an antidote developed from the evidence in James's files, she faced the court with her father's courage and her biological mother's determination. She described growing up with two mothers, one who had raised her with love despite being consumed by grief, and one who had protected her from afar at unimaginable personal cost. "My father died fighting this corruption," Emma declared, her voice clear and strong. "My brother," she looked at Michael with pride, "nearly lost everything continuing that fight. Both my mothers suffered because powerful men thought their lives were worth less than profits and power. Today, we're here to prove them wrong." The verdicts, when they came, were unanimous. Anderson and his co-conspirators were sentenced to life terms. The pharmaceutical companies were ordered to pay hundreds of millions in damages to their victims. The police department was placed under federal oversight, with Officer Miller appointed to lead a new anti-corruption task force. But the true victory wasn't in the sentences or the settlements. It was in the healing that followed. The money from the pharmaceutical companies was used to establish the James Thompson Memorial Medical Center, dedicated to providing free care to victims of medical discrimination. Michael's law firm, now headed by a chastened James Cooper, created a civil rights division focused on fighting systemic racism in the justice system. Sarah and Helen, both fully recovered, found themselves forming an unexpected friendship, united by their love for Emma and their shared experience of being manipulated by a corrupt system. They worked together at the medical center, turning their pain into purpose. As Michael watched his mother and Sarah consulting with patients, saw Emma interning at his law firm while still in high school, he realized that justice wasn't just about punishment. Sometimes it was about transformation, about turning places of deepest darkness into sources of light and healing. The truth had cost them dearly, but it had also set them free. 1 year after the verdicts, the Grove Street Market parking lot had been transformed into a community gathering space, renamed the Unity Plaza. On this particular Sunday morning, Michael Jennings stood at a podium, addressing a diverse crowd gathered for the opening of the James Thompson Center for Justice and Healing, a combined legal clinic and medical facility built where hatred had once sparked a revolution. Helen Jennings sat in the front row, her cancer in remission, holding hands with Sarah Thompson. Between them sat Emma, no longer the sick child who needed saving, but a poised young woman who had just won her high school social justice award. Officer Miller, now Captain Miller, stood proudly in his new reform-minded police uniform, representing the changing face of law enforcement in Springfield. "A year ago," Michael began, his voice carrying across the hushed crowd, "this parking lot was where ignorance and prejudice nearly destroyed 2 families. Today, it stands as proof that justice, like healing, requires more than just removing disease. It requires building something better in its place." The center would combine Michael's legal expertise with Helen's medical knowledge, offering free services to those who had been victims of systemic discrimination. Sarah had been instrumental in its creation, using her experience to help other families navigate the complex intersection of medical care and legal rights. James Cooper, who had found his own path to redemption, announced that his firm would provide permanent funding for the center's legal division. "Sometimes," he said during his speech, "courage isn't about being fearless. It's about admitting when you've been fearful and choosing to change." But the most powerful moment came when Emma unveiled the center's main entrance. Above the doors hung 2 photographs: James Thompson in his police uniform, and Helen Jennings receiving her medical degree. Below them, a quote captured the essence of their shared legacy: "Justice heals when truth and compassion meet." After the ceremony, as families mingled and children played in the new plaza, Michael watched Sarah and his mother sharing stories with new clients, their laughter carrying across the space where hatred had once flared. Emma, wearing a future lawyer t-shirt, was explaining the center's services to visitors, her natural empathy shining through. "Your father would be proud," Michael said as Emma joined him later. "Both of our fathers would be." Emma smiled, glancing at their mothers working together. "They already are," she said softly. "We're living their dream, turning pain into purpose, hatred into hope." As the sun set over Springfield, casting long shadows across Unity Plaza, Michael reflected on how far they'd come. The truth had nearly destroyed them all, but it had also rebuilt them into something stronger. The corrupt system they'd fought hadn't just been about police or pharmaceutical companies. It had been about the walls people build between each other, walls that only truth and compassion could tear down. Sarah caught his eye across the plaza and nodded, a gesture that carried the weight of their shared journey. They had started as enemies in a parking lot, divided by prejudice and manipulation. They ended as family, united by truth and the endless work of healing. Sometimes justice looked like a parking lot transformed into a plaza. Sometimes it looked like 2 families becoming one. Always, it looked like hope. Sometimes It looked like two families becoming one. Always, it looked like hope. If the story of justice, healing, and redemption touched your heart, please support our team by subscribing to our channel and hitting that like button. Share this video with your friends and family. Let's spread the message that love can overcome hate and truth can heal even the deepest wounds. Drop a comment below sharing your thoughts and emotions. Would you like to see part 2, where we explore what happens when Emma follows in both her father's footsteps to fight corruption in the healthcare system? Your support helps us continue telling these powerful stories that matter. Together, we can make a difference.